Hawthorne Haven Rehabilitation Center was a place many came to when they had nowhere else to turn. Nestled deep within a remote part of a rural town in the United States, it stood as a beacon of hope for those struggling with addiction. The facility, however, had a history few spoke about openly. It was built on the grounds of an old hospital, a place where unsettling events had unfolded decades before. Yet, for those desperate enough to seek salvation, the eerie past of the building was a small price to pay. Evan, a man in his early 40s, had hit rock bottom. Years of drug abuse had destroyed his relationships, his career, and almost his life. Checking into Hawthorne Haven was his last chance. The first few days were rough, as expected. Withdrawal symptoms hit him hard, and he found it difficult to sleep. But even when his body begged for rest, something kept him on edge, like a subtle tension in the air. The room he was assigned to was small, sterile, and cold. The walls were painted a dull, fading white, and a single window overlooked the dense woods that surrounded the facility. At night, the wind would howl through the trees, creating an unsettling soundtrack to the already oppressive atmosphere inside. Evan dismissed the unease at first, chalking it up to the effects of withdrawal. He had heard that the mind could play tricks on you during detox, especially after years of substance abuse. But what he experienced his third night, there was far beyond anything that could be explained by the usual symptoms. It started with the shadows. Evan lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, trying to calm his mind when he noticed something strange. At first, it was subtle. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, like they were crawling slowly along the walls. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and stared again. It was nothing, surely just his mind playing tricks on him. But as he continued to watch, the shadows grew darker, more defined, creeping towards him in unnatural, twisting movements. His breath quickened as he sat up in bed, heart pounding in his chest. He closed his eyes tightly, convincing himself that it was all in his head. It's just the drugs leaving your system, he thought. It's just a nightmare, and you're awake. But when he opened his eyes again, the room seemed darker, like the shadows were devouring what little light remained. Evan felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over him, a feeling he hadn't experienced even in his darkest moments of addiction. It was as if something was watching him, something malevolent and hungry, lurking just beyond the veil of reality. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with an unseen presence. Evan stumbled out of bed, his legs weak and shaky. He reached for the door, desperate to leave, but when his hand touched the cold metal doorknob, a whisper, faint but unmistakable, echoed from the far corner of the room. His body froze. The whisper wasn't in a language he recognized, but it carried a weight, a deep, guttural tone that made his skin crawl. Slowly, he turned his head towards the corner from which the sound had come. There, barely visible in the darkness, was a figure. It was tall, its form distorted and hazy, as if it were part of the shadows themselves. Red eyes glowed faintly from its face, piercing through the gloom, and its mouth, though twisted into what resembled a smile, was filled with malice. Evan's chest tightened as he tried to scream, but no sound came out. His voice, his strength, everything seemed to drain from him in that moment, leaving him paralyzed in fear. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, as though savoring Evan's terror. The room grew colder with each step it took, the temperature dropping so drastically that Evan could see his breath in the air. His heart raced, thudding so hard against his chest that he thought it might burst. As the figure reached the foot of his bed, it stopped, tilting its head slightly as if to observe him. Its red eyes flickered, and the whispering grew louder, surrounding Evan in a cacophony of incomprehensible voices. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The room returned to normal, the shadows retreating, the cold lifting. Evan collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air, his body drenched in sweat. He looked around frantically, but the figure was nowhere to be seen. Was it a hallucination? Was his mind unraveling under the pressure of withdrawal? He didn't know. But one thing was certain. Something was deeply wrong in Hawthorne Haven. As he sat there, trembling, Evan couldn't shake the feeling that whatever he had just witnessed wasn't merely a trick of his mind. Something had been there, something real, and it was still watching. The tension within Hawthorne Haven began to grow as more patients reported unsettling experiences. It started gradually, with whispers in the hallways about strange dreams and eerie sensations. At first, the staff dismissed these claims as normal side effects of detoxification. Hallucinations, paranoia, and anxiety were all common during withdrawal. But what the patients were experiencing went far beyond what any of them had been told to expect. Lisa, a young woman in her mid-20s, had been at the center for a few weeks. She was battling a severe opioid addiction, a habit that had taken her from college dropout to homeless in just a few short years. Hawthorne Haven was her last hope, but instead of finding solace, she found herself sinking deeper into a pit of fear she couldn't explain. Her nights were plagued by a recurring sensation. She would wake up abruptly, heart pounding, feeling as though someone was standing at the foot of her bed, watching her. At first, she thought it was a residual hallucination from the drugs, but the feeling persisted night after night. Each time she awoke, the sensation grew stronger, more oppressive. It wasn't just a fleeting moment of fear. It was an overwhelming presence, something that seemed to linger in the room with her, watching, waiting. One particularly sleepless night, Lisa decided to confront her fear. She sat up in bed, her hands trembling as she scanned the dark corners of her room. The air felt thicker, almost suffocating, as if the walls were closing in around her. She wanted to scream, to call for help, but something inside her knew that making a sound would only make things worse. The silence itself seemed to pulse with malevolence. And then she saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, something barely visible in the dim light from the hallway. But as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she saw the outline of a figure, tall, impossibly thin, and unnaturally still. Its head was tilted in a way that suggested it was observing her, like a predator sizing up its prey. For a moment, she froze, her mind racing. This isn't real. This can't be real, she thought. But no matter how many times she blinked or rubbed her eyes, the figure remained. The room grew colder. Lisa could see her breath now, misting in the air as she tried to calm herself. Her fingers gripped the edge of the blanket, knuckles white with fear. The figure didn't move, but its presence filled the room, an oppressive force that made her want to shrink away, to hide under the covers like a child. But she knew it would see her, no matter what. The worst part was the feeling. Something deep within her gut told her this wasn't just a hallucination, wasn't just her mind playing tricks on her. This was real, and it was coming for her. The next morning, Lisa tried to explain what had happened to the nurses, but they gave her the same reassuring explanation they gave everyone else. It was just the drugs leaving her system. Hallucinations were normal, they said. Anxiety, night terrors, sleep paralysis, it was all part of the process. But Lisa knew better. She had experienced withdrawal before, and this was different. This wasn't the usual nightmares or cold sweats. This was something darker, something that lurked in the very walls of the center. And it wasn't going away. Meanwhile, whispers of similar experiences began to spread among the other patients. Mark, an older man in his 50s who had checked in for alcohol addiction, started to notice things too. At first, it was just strange noises, soft whispers that seemed to follow him down the corridors, echoing off the sterile white walls. Then came the sense of being watched, an unsettling awareness that someone or something was just out of sight, always observing. He mentioned it during one of the group therapy sessions, but the others were too wrapped up in their own nightmares to pay much attention. Except for Evan. Evan, still reeling from his own terrifying encounter, couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had appeared in his room that night wasn't confined to him alone. The more he listened to the others, Lisa's haunted gaze, Mark's nervous glances down the hallways, the more he was convinced that something far more sinister was at play. It wasn't just their minds betraying them in the throes of withdrawal. There was a malevolent presence in Hawthorne Haven, something ancient and hungry, feeding on their fear and vulnerability. Dr. Taylor, the lead psychiatrist at the facility, remained skeptical. He had worked with addicts for years, seeing the worst effects of withdrawal, and he knew how fragile the human mind could become under such strain. When patients like Lisa or Mark brought up their fears, he would offer calm, clinical reassurances. "It's just a part of the process," he'd say. "Your mind is adjusting to sobriety. This is normal." But as more patients began to report similar experiences, even he couldn't fully dismiss what was happening. There was something about their eyes, the raw, unfiltered terror, that made him pause. Late at night, when the halls of the facility were quiet and the patients were meant to be asleep, Dr. Taylor would sometimes walk the corridors himself. He told himself it was to clear his head, but deep down, he was searching for something, some clue that would explain the growing sense of unease in the air. But what he found was always the same: silence, darkness, and the weight of something unseen pressing down on him, making the air feel heavy and thick. He wouldn't admit it, not even to himself, but there were moments when he too felt watched. Back in her room, Lisa stared at the ceiling, too afraid to close her eyes, too exhausted to keep them open. She knew it was only a matter of time before the figure returned. It always did, and this time, she wasn't sure she would survive the night. Evan's nights had become a relentless battle between sleep and waking nightmares. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt as if he was on the verge of being dragged into something dark, something hungry. His body was exhausted, every muscle aching from the withdrawal and the lack of rest. But the moment he drifted off, the same terrifying presence would jolt him awake. He could no longer tell what was real and what wasn't. On the fourth night, Evan woke abruptly, gasping for air. He was lying flat on his back, unable to move. His body was paralyzed, as though a massive weight had been placed on his chest. His breathing became shallow and rapid, panic setting in as he tried to force his limbs to respond. But no matter how hard he willed his body to move, he remained frozen in place. The room was impossibly quiet, the darkness pressing in from all sides. There was a flicker of movement near the corner of the ceiling, and Evan's eyes, the only part of him still able to move, darted toward it. A shadow lingered there, just beyond the edge of the light spilling in from the hallway. At first, Evan tried to convince himself that it was nothing, just a trick of the mind, a hallucination brought on by the withdrawal. But the shadow didn't dissipate. Instead, it shifted almost like it was coming to life. Slowly, it began to take form, a shape that grew darker, more defined. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was something real, something that seemed to crawl down the wall toward him, its movements unnatural, like it didn't belong to this world. As it descended, Evan's heart pounded against his chest. The weight on his body grew heavier, and the coldness in the room became unbearable. His breath came in short, desperate gasps as the figure moved closer. Its face began to materialize, distorted and twisted, as if it had been burned or scarred beyond recognition. The eyes, glowing a sickly red, stared directly into Evan's soul. They weren't human, nothing about this creature was. Its mouth curled into a grotesque smile, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth. The skin around its lips was pulled tight, creating an inhuman expression of malice. Then it spoke, not with words, but with a whisper so low, so guttural, that Evan felt it resonate deep within his bones. The sound was unintelligible, a language that made no sense, but it carried a weight of pure evil, a darkness that chilled him to the core. Evan's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. This isn't real. This isn't happening. It's just the drugs. It's just detox, he repeated to himself. But the more he tried to convince himself, the more real it became. The figure was now at the foot of his bed, its long, thin arms stretching out towards him. Its hands, skeletal and covered in rotting flesh, extended unnaturally long, the fingers tipped with sharp, claw-like nails. It reached for him slowly, as if savoring the moment. Evan's body remained frozen, his muscles locked in place as terror gripped him. He tried to scream, to call for help, but no sound escaped his lips. His throat felt like it was constricting, as if invisible hands were wrapped tightly around his neck, choking the air from him. The creature's whispering grew louder, more insistent, filling the room with an oppressive sense of dread. It was as though the walls themselves were closing in, suffocating him under the weight of something far beyond his understanding. Suddenly, the figure lurched forward, and Evan felt its cold, bony fingers wrap around his wrist. The touch was icy, like death itself, and the skin on his arm began to burn as if being seared by the creature's very presence. He could feel the malevolent energy coursing through his body, a force that sought to drain him of every last shred of hope and sanity. His mind reeled, filled with a cacophony of voices, all whispering the same chilling message: you will never escape. Just when Evan thought he was about to be consumed entirely, the figure vanished. It was as if the darkness itself had swallowed it whole, leaving behind only silence and the faintest trace of cold air. Evan gasped, his lungs finally able to expand as the paralysis lifted. He bolted upright, his heart racing so fast he thought it might explode. The room was quiet again, the shadows gone, but the oppressive sense of dread lingered. Evan clutched his wrist, half expecting to find deep, bloody marks where the creature had gripped him. But there was nothing. His skin was unmarked, though the burning sensation still lingered. He glanced around the room, half expecting the creature to return at any moment. But the only thing he could hear was his own ragged breathing. Had it been real? Was he losing his mind? Evan didn't know anymore. His rational mind told him it had to be a hallucination, a result of the detox, but his gut told him otherwise. Whatever he had just experienced was no mere product of his imagination. Something had been in that room with him, something ancient and full of malevolence, and it had left its mark on him, not on his body, but on his soul. Evan stumbled out of bed, his legs shaking beneath him, and rushed to the door. He needed to get out to find anyone, who could confirm that he wasn't losing his grip on reality. But as he reached for the door, he hesitated. What if it was still out there? What if it was waiting, lurking in the shadows just beyond his room? A cold shiver ran down his spine as he stood there, hand on the doorknob, paralyzed by the fear of what might be waiting for him on the other side. For the first time since arriving at Hawthorne Haven, Evan truly understood the depths of the horror he was facing. This wasn't just a battle against his addiction. Something far worse was at play, something that fed on weakness, on fear. And it was only just beginning. The following day, Evan found himself on edge, his nerves raw from the lack of sleep and the terror that gripped him in the night. He walked the sterile, dimly lit halls of Hawthorne Haven with a sense of unreality, as if at any moment, the ground beneath him might crumble, sending him plummeting into a darkness he could never escape. The other patients moved like ghosts around him, their hollow eyes and gaunt faces reflecting the same fear that gnawed at his own mind. Lisa, too, had changed. She sat in the common area, her knees pulled up to her chest, her eyes red and glassy from crying. She barely responded to the nurses when they tried to engage her, and when she did, it was with a far-off, distracted look, as though her mind had slipped into some unreachable place. Evan had seen her before, vibrant and determined despite the pain of detox. But now, she seemed broken, as if the fight had been drained from her completely. He wanted to ask her if she'd seen anything, if the shadows that haunted him were also haunting her. But fear kept his mouth shut. There was something about acknowledging it, about speaking the terror aloud, that felt dangerous, like it might invite the darkness in further. So he said nothing, but as he passed her in the hallway, their eyes met, and in that brief moment he saw it. She knew. Later that day, during a group therapy session, the unease that had been bubbling beneath the surface finally began to spill over. Mark, the older man who had been there for alcohol addiction, had been quiet for most of the session, his eyes darting nervously around the room. When it was his turn to speak, his voice was shaky, his hands trembling as he tried to articulate what had been happening to him. I don't know how to say this without sounding crazy, Mark began, his voice barely above a whisper. But I think something's in here with us. I've seen it, at night, in my room. It's like a shadow, but it's not just a shadow. It feels wrong. There was a murmur among the group, and Dr. Taylor, the psychiatrist, leaned forward, his face composed but with a slight frown of concern. Mark, it's normal to experience hallucinations during detox. Your mind is No, Mark interrupted, his voice rising, panic edging into his tone. This isn't a hallucination. I know what those are. This is different. I can feel it watching me. It's waiting for something. And it's not just me. Lisa's seen it too, haven't you? Lisa, who had been staring blankly at the floor, flinched at the sound of her name. She didn't respond at first, but the silence in the room grew so heavy that eventually she lifted her head. Her voice was barely audible, but her words sent a chill through everyone present. I don't sleep anymore, she whispered, because every time I close my eyes, I see it. It stands at the foot of my bed just watching me. I think it wants us to give up. Dr. Taylor opened his mouth to speak, but the fear in Lisa's voice made him hesitate. His usual clinical reassurance felt hollow in the face of their raw terror. He shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable, but determined to maintain control of the situation. I understand that what you're experiencing feels real, Dr. Taylor said carefully, but you have to trust the process. The mind plays tricks during withdrawal, especially when we're feeling vulnerable. You're not alone in this. We're here to help. Evan sat silent through the exchange, his heart pounding as the memories of his own encounter from the night before flooded back to him. The figure, the whispers, the unbearable cold. It had felt so real, more real than any drug-induced hallucination he'd ever experienced. And now, hearing Mark and Lisa describe something so similar, he felt a growing sense of dread. He wanted to speak up, to tell them that he had seen it too, that it wasn't just in their minds. But something held him back. The fear that speaking it into existence might make it worse, might draw the attention of whatever was stalking them. The session ended without much resolution. Dr. Taylor insisted on increasing their medication to help manage the hallucinations, but Evan could see it in his eyes. He was shaken. He wasn't sure whether to believe them or not, but the collective fear was becoming impossible to ignore. That night, Evan lay in bed, wide awake, staring at the ceiling as his mind raced. He couldn't shake the feeling that the presence, the thing that had appeared in his room, wasn't just a hallucination brought on by withdrawal. It was something darker, something ancient. The thought kept returning to him. This place, Hawthorne Haven, had a history. He didn't know the details, but there was something about the building, about the grounds it had been built on, that seemed to hold a dark, lingering energy. Around midnight, the air in his room grew colder again. Evan's breath hitched as he felt it, the familiar sensation of being watched. He glanced toward the corner, where the shadows had gathered before. His pulse quickened, and then the whispering started, low at first, like a distant wind, but gradually growing louder, more insistent. The voices were unintelligible, layered over one another, but their tone was clear: malice, anger, hunger. Evan gripped the edge of his blanket, fear rooting him to the spot. He wanted to run, to get out of the room, out of the building, but something in the whispering held him in place. The shadows in the corner shifted, and the figure emerged again. It was darker this time, more solid, as if it had fed off the fear in the room, growing stronger with each encounter. Its red eyes glowed with a sinister light, and the twisted, mocking smile returned to its lips. Evan's body trembled as the figure moved closer, its long, clawed fingers reaching out toward him. This time, it didn't stop at the foot of his bed. It kept coming, its movements slow, deliberate, as if it had all the time in the world. And then, the whispering stopped, replaced by a single, chilling voice, deep and resonant, echoing through Evan's mind. "You cannot escape." Evan tried to scream, but no sound came. His body was frozen in place, just like before, and the figure loomed over him, its presence suffocating. The cold radiated from it, seeping into his bones, making his skin crawl with an unnatural chill. As the figure's hand reached his chest, Evan felt a pressure, like something was being pulled from him, drained. His vision blurred, his heartbeat slowing as darkness crept in from the edges of his sight. He felt his consciousness slipping away, like the figure was pulling him into the void with it. And just when he thought he might lose himself entirely, the figure vanished, leaving behind only the echo of its chilling words in his mind. "You belong to me now." The morning after his latest encounter, Evan awoke drenched in sweat, his entire body trembling. His chest still felt heavy, as if the figure's cold fingers had left an imprint deep within him. It wasn't just a lingering sense of fear. It was something more profound, something that clung to his soul. Every breath felt labored, as if the very air in Hawthorne Haven had grown thick, saturated with the oppressive presence that now seemed to lurk around every corner. He staggered out of bed, barely able to steady himself, and stumbled toward the bathroom. His reflection in the mirror startled him. His face was pale, almost sickly, with dark circles under his eyes. He barely recognized himself. His once sharp features had become gaunt, his eyes hollow and bloodshot from nights without sleep. But worse than his appearance was the unmistakable sense that something was wrong inside him. He felt weaker, as if the figure had stolen a part of him in the night, leaving a void that he couldn't explain. The whisper still echoed faintly in his mind, and the creature's words, "You belong to me now," replayed on a relentless loop, making it impossible to think clearly. He splashed cold water on his face, trying to shake off the fog of exhaustion and fear, but nothing seemed to help. He wasn't just scared, he was losing his grip on reality, and he knew it. Evan made his way to the common room, his steps unsteady, his mind frayed. Mark and Lisa were already there, sitting in tense silence. They looked as bad as he felt, their faces drawn and haunted. The room itself seemed darker, the air heavier, as though the very walls of Hawthorne Haven were absorbing their collective fear. Evan couldn't help but notice that the other patients had become quieter too. Everyone was on edge, avoiding eye contact, speaking in hushed tones as if they feared drawing the attention of something unseen. Lisa glanced up at Evan as he entered, her eyes wide with fear. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, her hands trembling as she clutched a coffee cup. Without saying a word, she motioned for him to sit beside her. He did, feeling an odd sense of comfort in the shared silence between them. They didn't need to speak to know that they were all going through the same thing. But it was Mark who finally broke the tension. His voice was low, almost a whisper, as he leaned in close. "It's not just us," he said, his eyes darting nervously around the room as though expecting the shadows to come alive at any moment. "I talked to some of the older patients, people who've been here longer. They've seen it too. It's been happening for years." Evan frowned, his stomach turning at the implication. "What do you mean?" "There's something wrong with this place," Mark continued, his voice trembling. "It's not just a detox center. Something dark is here, something that preys on people when they're at their weakest. The withdrawals, the fear, the desperation, it feeds on it. People see things in this place, terrible things, and they don't just go away." Lisa's voice, weak but determined, cut through the growing dread. "Some people never leave. They die in their sleep or they disappear." Evan felt a chill run down his spine. His rational mind wanted to dismiss it all as paranoia, as withdrawal-induced hallucinations that had spiraled out of control. But after everything he had experienced, the cold, the whispers, the figure in his room, he knew there was more to it. This wasn't just in their heads. Something was here, something malevolent, and it was growing stronger. "I think it's targeting us," Evan muttered, his throat dry. "It comes at night, when we're alone. It takes something from you. I felt it last night, like it was draining me. I thought I was going to die." Mark nodded grimly. "That's what it does. I've heard stories. People say it feeds off your soul. Every time you see it, every time it touches you, it takes a part of you with it. And eventually, when there's nothing left, you're gone." A deep sense of hopelessness settled over the group, the weight of the truth pressing down on them. Evan's hands clenched into fists, his pulse racing as a wave of fear washed over him. He could feel the presence, even now, lurking just out of sight, waiting for nightfall to descend once again. "We can't just sit here and wait for it to come back," Lisa said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to figure out what it wants." Mark shook his head slowly. "It doesn't want anything. It just wants to consume. That's how it works. But there has to be a reason why it's here, why it started with us." Evan glanced around the room, his mind racing. There had to be something they could do, some way to fight back. But what? This wasn't a normal haunting. some ghost that could be appeased with a ritual or a cleansing. This was darker, more insidious. It had power over them, power that seemed to grow stronger with every passing night. He turned to Lisa, desperation in his eyes. "Do you know anything about the history of this place? Has anyone talked about, I don't know, something that might explain what's happening?" Lisa bit her lip, her brow furrowing in thought. "I've heard rumors," she admitted. "The building, it wasn't always a detox center. Before it was Hawthorne Haven, it was something else. I don't know the full story, but people say there were experiments. Things they did to the patients here, things they tried to cover up. Maybe that's connected to whatever this thing is." Evan felt a flicker of hope amidst the fear. It wasn't much, but it was something, a lead, a possible explanation for the horror that had taken root in the walls of Hawthorne Haven. If they could dig deeper, find out the truth about the building's past, maybe they could understand what was happening to them. And maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to stop it. "We need to find out more," Evan said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "There has to be records, something that tells us what really happened here." Mark glanced over his shoulder, his face pale. "We'd have to be careful. If the staff finds out, they'll think we've lost it. They'll lock us down, increase our meds. And if we're drugged up, we'll be even more vulnerable." Evan nodded, knowing Mark was right. They had to tread carefully, or they risked losing the little control they had left. But doing nothing wasn't an option. Not anymore. As the day wore on, Evan's mind churned with plans. He knew that time was running out. Night would fall soon, and when it did, the figure would return, stronger, hungrier, more determined to take another piece of him. He had to find answers before it was too late. That evening, as the shadows began to lengthen and the familiar chill crept back into the air, Evan steeled himself for what was to come. The others were counting on him, and though fear coursed through his veins, though the weight of the unknown threatened to crush him, he knew one thing for certain. Whatever was haunting Hawthorne Haven, it wasn't just going to stop. It would keep coming. It would take them all, one by one, until there was nothing left. And tonight, it was Evan's turn to fight back. As the night descended once again over Hawthorne Haven, the entire building seemed to groan under the weight of something unseen, something dark and ancient. The familiar, suffocating chill crept through the air, seeping into the very bones of the facility. Evan could feel at the moment the sun disappeared beyond the horizon. His body reacted before his mind could register the fear, a tightness in his chest, a sense of impending doom that had become all too familiar. But this time was different. This time, Evan had a plan. Earlier that day, after their tense conversation in the common room, Evan, Lisa, and Mark had scoured the building for any clue that might explain what was haunting them. It hadn't been easy, sneaking around the staff, avoiding prying eyes, but eventually, they found what they were looking for in the most unexpected place, the basement. In a forgotten storage room, buried beneath old medical records and broken furniture, they found it. A box of old files, dusty and yellowed with age, detailing the early years of Hawthorne Haven. It turned out that the rumors were true. Before it became a detox center, Hawthorne Haven had been a mental asylum, one with a particularly gruesome history. According to the records, the asylum had been shut down in the 1950s after a series of mysterious deaths. Patients had begun disappearing, one by one, their bodies never found. The staff claimed the patients had simply run away, but there had been whispers of something else, something darker that lurked within the asylum's walls. And those who had stayed behind had reported seeing a figure in the shadows, a presence that fed off the fear and despair of the patients. Evan had felt a sickening twist in his gut as he read the reports. The same figure they had seen, the same malevolent force that stalked them at night. It had been here all along, preying on the vulnerable for decades. The asylum had been shut down, but the evil remained, lurking in the dark corners of the building, waiting for new victims to come along. As he stared at the old files, his mind reeled with a horrific realization. They weren't just hallucinating. This wasn't some side effect of detox or withdrawal. They were being hunted by something real, something that had been growing stronger for decades, feeding off the misery of anyone who entered its domain. That knowledge had given them a sense of purpose, a grim determination. If they were going to survive, they needed to find out what this entity was and how to stop it. And that meant digging deeper into the building's history, into the dark rituals and twisted practices that had taken place within its walls. Now, as Evan sat alone in his room, waiting for the inevitable return of the figure, he tried to steady his breathing. His mind raced with the information they'd uncovered. According to the old asylum records, there had been one patient in particular who had drawn the attention of the staff, a man named Jacob Holloway. Holloway had been institutionalized for violent delusions, but he had claimed, up until the day he disappeared, that he was being tormented by a demon. He said the demon was feeding off him, consuming his fear, his soul. The staff had dismissed it as madness, but now, in light of everything that had happened, Evan knew better. Holloway hadn't been crazy. He had been the first victim of the entity that now stalked them. The only clue they had to stopping it was buried in Holloway's file. One of the last things he had written, scrawled in shaky handwriting on a piece of paper found in his room, had been a cryptic message. It's bound to the dark. Bring the light, and it cannot take you. The words had stuck with Evan. He didn't know exactly what they meant, but they gave him a sense of hope. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't invincible. There was a way to fight it, a way to drive it back. And tonight, Evan intended to find out how. The hours dragged on, the oppressive silence of the building broken only by the occasional distant creak or soft murmur from the other patients. Everyone was on edge. The terror had spread like a virus, infecting every corner of Hawthorne Haven. But Evan couldn't let the fear consume him. He had to stay focused. As midnight approached, the temperature in the room plummeted, and Evan knew it was coming. He could feel the darkness pressing in, the air growing thick with an unnatural stillness. His pulse quickened, every nerve in his body screaming at him to run, to escape while he still could. But there was nowhere to go. The entity would find him, no matter where he hid. The only option left was to confront it. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, swirling and shifting as the presence made itself known. Evan's breath caught in his throat as he felt the icy cold sweep over him. And then, slowly, the figure emerged. This time, it was clearer than ever before, its form more solid, more defined. The thing wasn't just a shadow anymore. It had a shape now, a grotesque, hulking silhouette with glowing red eyes and long, twisted fingers that seemed to reach for him from the darkness. The air around it crackled with malevolent energy, and Evan felt the crushing weight of its gaze settle on him like a physical force. But he didn't flinch. He couldn't afford to. Clutching the small flashlight he had found earlier, his fingers trembling, Evan clicked it on, casting a narrow beam of light into the room. The creature recoiled instantly, hissing as the light hit it. Its form flickered, distorting as though the light was burning it, driving it back. Evan's heart raced with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. Holloway had been right. The light was the key. But the creature wasn't done. With a snarl, it surged forward again, faster this time, more determined. The light faltered for a moment, and Evan's heart nearly stopped as the figure lunged toward him, its red eyes glowing with pure malice. He scrambled to adjust the beam, focusing it on the creature's chest. The reaction was immediate. The figure let out an ear-splitting shriek, its form twisting violently as the light seared through it. For the first time, Evan saw it falter, saw the way the light disrupted its shape, causing it to lose its grip on the physical world. But it wasn't enough. The flashlight was too weak, its beam too narrow to hold the creature at bay for long. Evan knew he needed more light, more power, something strong enough to banish the darkness completely. With the entity still writhing in agony before him, Evan made a split-second decision. He bolted from the room, flashlight in hand, racing down the darkened hallway toward the common room where Mark and Lisa were waiting. His heart pounded in his chest as he ran, the creature's furious shrieks echoing behind him, growing more distant with each step. They had found a weakness, but now they needed a plan. The night wasn't over, and the demon wasn't going to let them go so easily. It would be back stronger, more vengeful than ever. And if they couldn't find a way to destroy it, they wouldn't survive another night in Hawthorne Haven. Evan burst into the common room, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the adrenaline still pumping through his veins. Mark and Lisa were huddled by the windows, their faces pale and drawn, clearly sensing that the night had already begun its assault. They turned toward him as he entered, their eyes widening in alarm at the sight of him drenched in sweat, clutching the small flashlight like a lifeline. "It works," Evan managed between gasps, his voice hoarse with fear and exhaustion. "The light, it burns it. It drives it back." Mark stood up quickly, his expression a mixture of hope and disbelief. "Are you sure? Did it stop it?" Evan shook his head, still panting. "Not completely. It weakened it, but it's too strong. We need something brighter, something more powerful. That thing isn't just a shadow anymore. It's growing stronger." Lisa's face paled even further, and she glanced around the room nervously, as if expecting the creature to materialize at any moment. "What are we supposed to do? There's no way we can fight it off forever. If it's getting stronger, it's only a matter of time before it breaks through." Evan could hear the rising panic in her voice, and for a moment he felt it too, the crushing weight of hopelessness that had been threatening to overtake him since this nightmare began. But he couldn't afford to give in to it, not now. They were so close. They had a weapon, a way to push the creature back. They just needed to find out how to use it more effectively. "There has to be something else in this building," Evan said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Something brighter. Emergency lights, floodlights, anything that can produce more light. If we can hit it with a strong enough beam, we might be able to destroy it." Mark frowned, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Maybe the generator room? There's got to be backup lighting for the facility in case of power outages." Evan nodded, his mind racing. "That's a start. If we can find the generator and turn on the backup lights, we'll have a better chance of holding it off. We can lure it into the brightest spot and trap it there." Lisa shook her head, her voice trembling. "But it's not just about the lights, is it? This thing is not going to stop coming after us. We're just buying time." Evan's stomach churned at the truth in her words. The light might hold the creature back temporarily, but it wouldn't be enough to banish it for good. Not unless they found a way to sever its connection to the building, to the very darkness it thrived on. His thoughts drifted back to Jacob Holloway's file, to the cryptic note about the light. Holloway had been onto something, but he hadn't lived long enough to figure out how to end it. The entity was bound to the darkness, to the fear and suffering that had festered in Hawthorne Haven for decades. And unless they found a way to sever that bond, it would keep feeding on them until there was nothing left. "We'll figure that out later," Evan said, more to himself than to the others. "Right now, we just need to survive the night." Mark nodded grimly, grabbing a flashlight from a nearby table and turning it on. "Let's move. The generator room should be in the basement. If we can get there without running into that thing." He didn't finish the sentence, but the unspoken fear lingered in the air between them. They all knew what was at stake. If the creature found them before they could activate the backup lights, there wouldn't be a second chance. Evan led the way, his heart hammering in his chest as they crept through the darkened hallways of Hawthorne Haven. Every shadow felt alive, every creak and groan of the old building sending a jolt of terror through his body. The flashlight beam wavered in his trembling hand, but he forced himself to stay focused, to keep moving forward. Behind him, he could hear Mark and Lisa's shaky breaths, the tension thick enough to cut through. They reached the stairwell that led down to the basement, the air growing colder with each step they took. The walls seemed to close in around them, the oppressive darkness pressing against their skin, making it harder to breathe. Evan's mind raced, imagining the figure lurking just beyond the edges of the flashlight's beam, waiting for the right moment to strike. They reached the door to the generator room, a heavy steel door with a rusted handle that screeched as Mark pushed it open. The room beyond was pitch black, the stale smell of oil and machinery thick in the air. Evan's stomach twisted at the sight. This room felt wrong, like a place where the darkness had settled and taken root. The beam from his flashlight swept across the room, revealing rows of old, dusty machines, their metal surfaces gleaming faintly in the dim light. At the far end of the room, the generator loomed like a hulking beast, silent and cold. Evan's hands trembled as he approached the control panel, his fingers fumbling over the switches. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier with each passing second, as if the entity was already aware of what they were trying to do. He could feel it watching, lurking just beyond the reach of the light. "Come on," he muttered to himself, flipping the switches in a frantic attempt to bring the generator to life. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the sound of their labored breathing. Then, with a sudden jolt, the generator roared to life, flooding the room with a deafening mechanical hum. Lights flickered on overhead, dim at first but growing brighter, pushing back the shadows that had been creeping in from the corners. The surge of power was like a rush of hope, a fleeting moment of triumph. But then, just as quickly as it had come, the moment shattered. A piercing scream echoed through the basement, a sound so inhuman and filled with rage that it froze Evan in place. He spun around, the flashlight beam cutting through the air just in time to see the figure materializing at the far end of the room. It was larger now, its form more solid than ever before, its glowing red eyes burning with hatred. The light from the generator flickered, dimming as the creature stepped forward, its presence distorting the air around it. The ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble, the walls of the room vibrating as if the entity was pulling the very fabric of reality apart. "It's coming!" Lisa's voice was a panicked shriek, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly as she backed away from the advancing figure. Evan's mind raced, his pulse pounding in his ears. They had done everything right, activated the lights, pushed back the darkness. But it wasn't enough. The creature was stronger than ever, and it was coming for them. In a desperate move, Evan grabbed one of the portable work lamps from the side of the room and flipped it on, directing its harsh, blinding light toward the figure. The creature shrieked again, its form wavering as the light seared into it. But it kept advancing, its rage growing with every step. "We need more light," Mark shouted, his voice thick with terror. "Flood the room." Evan fumbled with the other lamps, switching them on one by one, their beams piercing the darkness. The creature writhed, its form becoming less distinct, but it wasn't retreating. It was fighting back, pushing against the light with a force that felt almost physical. The lights flickered again, and Evan's heart sank. The generator was straining under the pressure, and the creature seemed to be feeding off the very energy they were using to fight it. "We need to get out of here," Lisa screamed, her voice rising in hysteria. But Evan knew there was no escape. Not yet. Not until they found a way to end this once and for all. The generator room buzzed with a low hum, but it wasn't enough to drown out the creature's piercing screeches. The lights above flickered, stuttering like a dying heartbeat, casting twisted shadows across the walls. The entity, now more monstrous and terrifying than ever, advanced toward them with a purpose, its glowing red eyes burning holes into the reality around it. Each step it took sent a shockwave of dread through the air, an oppressive force that made it almost impossible to breathe. Evan, Lisa, and Mark stood frozen in a ring of artificial light, the heat of the portable work lamps radiating off their skin as the last barrier between them and the demon. But the lights were faltering, flickering, dimming. Evan knew they were running out of time. The entity was growing stronger, feeding off their fear, their desperation. It wouldn't stop until it had consumed them. "Evan, do something!" Lisa screamed, her voice cracking with panic. She was backing away, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. The flashlight in her hand trembled violently, the beam wavering as if the light itself was afraid. Evan's mind raced, trying to think of a solution, a way to defeat something that seemed invincible. They had light, but the demon was adapting, learning how to resist it. The truth hit him like a punch to the gut. They couldn't just scare it off. They needed to sever its connection to the building, to the suffering it had been feeding on for decades. And they had to do it now. In his panic, he remembered the files they had found, the old records from the asylum days, particularly the cryptic note left by Jacob Holloway. "It's bound to the dark. Bring the light, and it cannot take you." But there had to be more to it. Evan couldn't shake the feeling that Holloway had discovered something important before his disappearance. Something about the nature of the demon's power. Suddenly it clicked. Holloway had understood that the demon wasn't just a physical entity. It was bound to the building itself, to the darkness that had settled over Hawthorne Haven for years. The fear, the suffering, the despair, they were fuel for the demon, making it stronger. The light disrupted its form, but only for a moment. To truly defeat it, they needed to cut off its source of power. They needed to cleanse the building of the very darkness that had given the demon life. Evan's eyes darted to the control panel for the generator. An idea, reckless but the only option, began to form in his mind. "We need to overload the lights," he said, his voice rising over the creature's growls. "We need to blow the entire system, flood the building with as much light as we can. If we can hit it all at once, every single light on at full power, it might be enough to sever its connection to the darkness. It's feeding on this place, but if we blind it, are you insane?" Mark shot back, his voice tight with fear. "That could fry the generator. We might burn the whole place down." Evan met Mark's gaze, his eyes blazing with grim determination. "Better to burn this place to the ground than let that thing take us." Mark hesitated, but the weight of the situation pressed down on him. He could see the logic in Evan's plan. There was no running from this. They were trapped, and the only way out was to destroy the demon before it destroyed them. "Fine," Mark said, gritting his teeth. "Let's do it." Together, they rushed to the generator controls, their hands moving with frantic speed. Evan flipped the switches, bypassing the safety protocols that limited the power output. The hum of the generator intensified, rising to a dangerous pitch. The lights above flickered, then flared with blinding intensity. It felt like the building itself was trembling, straining under the sudden surge of energy. The demon let out a bone-chilling roar, its form distorting and flickering wildly as the flood of light hit it. Its twisted silhouette wavered, unraveling at the edges as though it were being torn apart by the brightness. The oppressive air around them seemed to lift, just for a moment, as the creature was forced back. But it wasn't enough. The lights flickered again, dimming for just a second. Enough time for the demon to regroup. Its form solidified, and with a deafening screech, it surged forward, faster and more vicious than before. The shadows in the room pulsed, warping the space around it, dragging the air into a crushing void of darkness. Lisa screamed, her back against the wall, as the creature lashed out. Its twisted, clawed hand shot forward, slamming into the work lamps, shattering the fragile bulbs in a spray of glass. One by one, the lights began to go out, the room plunging deeper into darkness. Evan's heart pounded in his chest, fear tightening its grip around him. They were losing. The demon was too strong. Even with all the light they had, it wasn't enough to break the hold it had over the building. And now, with the lights failing, they were out of options. But then, in the corner of his eye, Evan saw it, the old fire alarm, a relic of the asylum days. His mind raced. Fire alarms in older buildings were often linked to emergency lighting systems, floodlights designed to illuminate every corner of the facility in case of evacuation. It was their last hope. Without thinking, Evan bolted toward the alarm, his hand shaking as he reached for the lever. The demon screeched, sensing his intent, and lunged toward him, its twisted face contorted with fury. But Evan didn't stop. He yanked the lever down with all his strength. For a moment, nothing happened. The room seemed to freeze, the demon looming over him, its red eyes blazing with rage. Then, with a sudden burst, the emergency lights exploded into life. Blinding white light flooded the entire basement, searing through the darkness like a blade. Every shadow was obliterated, every inch of the room bathed in the harsh, unrelenting glow. The demon let out a final, blood-curdling scream as the light tore through it, its form unraveling, disintegrating into nothingness. The force of it was so intense that Evan was thrown backward, his vision flashing white as the light consumed everything around him. The sound of the creature's scream faded, replaced by an eerie, unnatural silence. When Evan opened his eyes, the basement was still. The lights above hummed softly, casting long, unbroken beams across the room. The demon was gone, its presence erased, as if it had never existed. Evan lay on the cold floor, his chest rising and falling with labored breaths. Lisa and Mark were beside him, their faces pale but alive. For the first time in days, the air felt lighter. The suffocating darkness that had haunted Hawthorne Haven was gone. The building finally free of the evil that had consumed it for so long. They had survived. As they slowly stood, battered and exhausted, Evan couldn't shake the feeling that they had been lucky. Whatever had happened in that building, whatever had taken root there, had been old, ancient, and powerful. And though they had escaped, he knew that places like Hawthorne Haven didn't just let go. The darkness would always be waiting, somewhere, for the next soul to wander too close. With a heavy heart, Evan led them back upstairs, away from the basement, from the horrors that had unfolded there. The building was eerily quiet now, the oppressive weight of the demon's presence lifted. But the scars it left behind would linger, etched into the very walls of the place. As they stepped out into the cool night air, the stars above seeming impossibly distant, Evan took one last look at the building. He knew he would never forget what had happened inside, nor the truth he had uncovered. Some darkness can't be escaped. It can only be faced, and even then, the fight is never truly over. Because evil doesn't die, it waits,